So what is this nature and the scale of the threat from Islamic State, and what should UK government's response be? I'm joined now by Diana Dark, an author and Syria specialist, David Taub, the Director of Policy at anti-extremism organisation Quilliam, and Macer Gifford, who is a nom de plume, fought against the Islamic State in Syria with the Kurdish YPG militia. Good evening and welcome to all of you. Diana Dark, first of all, we hear that Donald Trump will soon be able to stand up and say 100% of the caliphate is gone. Is this a very simplistic statement?
Of course. What would you expect? But yes, of course.
But is it a dangerous statement for him to make?
Incredibly dangerous because of the consequences it's already set in train. And it's led to, obviously, a sort of power struggle and lots of instability and question marks about what's going to happen to this whole 30% of Syria east of the Euphrates. So big question marks, nothing is resolved, nobody knows what on earth is going to happen next. Plus, of course, it means that Turkey is now not focused on Idlib, and so extremists, the Jabhat al-Nusra group there, the extremists have pushed forward unprevented by Turkey, so they're now controlling 70 to 80% of that area. So extremism is on the rise in Idlib, while supposedly it's being clamped down on in the final pockets of Daesh.
But they say
ISIS.
the final, and of course Donald Trump will say the final pockets of Daesh,
Yes,
but what you know is that actually they're very good at the retreat. And what
Yes.
they'll be doing is moving quietly around in sleeper cells.
Absolutely. They're very, very practiced. They've got 15 years' experience of this kind of terrain, from the Iraq invasion since 2003. So they've got good relationships with tribal leaders. They know how to disappear in this kind of landscape. So, yes, they're very, very practiced.
Well, you fought alongside the Kurds. What's your experience, and what do you say to Diana's position that actually they're all around anyway? The threat is even greater in a way because it has dissipated.
Absolutely. Well, the real challenge now is the difficult peace in Syria. We've done the hard work. We've defeated their so-called caliphate. The real challenge now is to make Syrians feel liberated. We need to invest in the country. We need to invest in their democracy, to give them a voice, and really give them the tools to defeat ISIS in the long term, because it's the vicious ideology that's left behind that's the worst.
And when you saw that at first hand, what was that like with the Kurds? I mean, how did they operate?
Well, I think I've often said that to really appreciate how horrible the Islamic State is, what they've done to Syria, is to see it up close. Sure, they've hit us in some of the most delicate places in our psyche in the UK, in Manchester, our kids, in Westminster with our democracy. But what I saw on the ground was entire communities devastated, entire generations murdered, young men and boys killed in ditches, young girls sold into slavery. So what we've fought against here is really the very worst of humanity.
And of the people that make up ISIS, we don't know how many really are British, do we? We have a good idea because we think there's many hundreds of women and children there, but we know that there's many hundreds back here as well.
Yeah, well, one statistic is a horrifying statistic is that only 1 in 8 jihadis that fought in the Syrian civil war have actually faced a courtroom, and that's already. So the British government's record on this is not good. So what I hope is that new legislation is introduced that will tackle them.
Diana Dark, what about that? Only 1 in 8.
Well, it doesn't surprise me, actually. And I think the other thing, we're busy talking about ISIS as if this is the only problem in Syria, but it's very important to remember that the problem, the whole reason behind the Syrian war, the uprising against the Assad regime, I mean, Assad is still there, the problem is still there. And although the military battle is winding down, the social and economic war is only just beginning. And the levels of deprivation, even in government-controlled Syria, are extreme. I mean, you're talking about 2/3 of the Syrian population living in poverty.
Which brings us on to David and your view of how best the British government can handle both British ISIS fighters and their families who are still there and ones that are here.
Well, we clearly have an obligation here. There are many things that Britain ought to be exporting to the rest of the world, but terrorists are not one of them. And we have an obligation to make sure that wherever possible, and I don't want to underestimate to any degree the difficulty of doing so, those who have committed crimes are brought before British courts and tried, and if the evidence is there, convicted.
We know today that there's been a new power as part of the Counter-Terrorism Border Security Bill, which got royal assent today, which makes it easier to prosecute returning jihadis.
Yes, and it's our national obligation to do so. I mean, we're a state that is founded on the rule of law, and it is the thing that makes us more resilient and also better than the caliphate. We need to show that we implement the rule of law.
But what would you say should happen to the women that went to fight and to be with fighters? Children aside, because Russia took children alone, France took women and children but have separated the women and children. Should the women that went there be treated in exactly the same way?
I really do think that. The Kurds have been quite clear. They've turned to Europe and they've said, please, pick up your trash. At the end of the day, thousands of Britons, Frenchmen, Germans came over to Syria to ruin Syria, to murder people, to commit terrible atrocities. And now the Syrians have defeated them, and they're currently in camps now being fed by the Syrian people who are going through terrible hardship, as we've just heard. And they feel a huge amount of injustice, that the world is really not doing enough for them.
But, David, we already know, we just heard that one of the young women from East London wants back.
Right.
So back to face what?
Well, we need to differentiate between women and children.
Yes. But then what about the radicalisation of children who are then maybe 12 and 13 now? How do we help them?
Well, the starting point is that the age of criminal responsibility in Britain is 10, which is pretty young. Children from the age of 9 or 10 will have received potentially military training. They will have been radicalised. But that doesn't mean that all of them are effectively time bombs waiting to go off. We have obligations, international obligations, under the optional protocol, which obliges this country to take steps to rehabilitate and socially integrate those who return. Children have to be treated separately, and that is the way our criminal justice as a whole works.
So might we do what France has done, which is bring women back, but separate them from their children?
Well, I think that children are only brought back in France if they have the explicit permission of the mothers. But we do have an obligation to save children from being rendered stateless.
Well, and I'm going to talk to you in a minute about the anti-radicalisation programmes, but Diana Dark, what is the threat from ISIS in the UK? Is it the spread of ideas, or is it the threat of an actual attack?
I think it's the threat. Well, it's both, but I think it's potentially the threat of an attack. The ideology is very powerful.
Because we know that MI5, what is it, 20-odd thousand people are of interest already.
But again, I think it's very important to say that here we are focusing on this tiny numbers. I mean, only 1% of the Syrian population joined ISIS. Yeah. It's not really anything to do with Syria, nothing to do with it. And because a few British people are involved, this is what we, the international community, focus on at the expense of the much, much bigger problem. 2 million Syrian children, that's half the numbers of children in Syria, have never known anything but war. And they're orphaned, uneducated. That generation, what are they going to feel? What are they going to grow up to become? They are natural recruitment territory for the new wave of ISIS-2 or whatever's coming.
But the complexity of that, of course, is that Syria is under the control of Assad.
Yes.
So
precisely,
how far do we go, for the greater good of the children, knowing that Assad is the one that we are leaving in power?
Well, this is the huge dilemma, and we've just left it all too late now, because we've abdicated all responsibility. Russia's taken over. Russia's calling the shots, and sadly we are left a bit impotent at the moment. Are
we impotent now then?
We're not impotent. There are things that we can do if we think intelligently and carefully about how we approach returnees. Returnees are going to fall into one of three categories. There will be those who are disillusioned, who went out with a dream of a caliphate which turned into a nightmare. And they are probably the easiest to rehabilitate, because they've already decided that what's gone on is an appalling disaster. And
or have they decided that they have to get out quick?
Well, the difficulty, of course, is going to be working out which ones are genuinely disillusioned and who are pretending to be so to get back home. And there will, of course, be people who fall into a second category, who are those who are dangerous. And we already know Medina Mouche, for example, who is on trial in Belgium for a massacre at a Jewish museum, looks as if he was trained and quite possibly sent back to Europe in order to commit atrocities. So they are the people who are going to need the closest focus. But there are also going to be people there who are disturbed, and those who are disturbed are going to need mental health treatment as part of the package.
But you have, as you say, seen ISIS at first hand, seen the way they operate. Do you have sympathy for example, the young girl, which not so much of a young girl now, who says she wants to come home? I mean, what should the British government's response be to her?
Well, quite strict. We mustn't forget now that in 2014, when at the height of the crisis, where Mosul fell, where we saw the Yazidis trapped in cages, it was ladies like that who decided to go out to Syria. It was their decision to go.
Yes, that had happened by then, of course.
Of course. So they had seen it on the news, and they had agreed with it and gone out. And now that the ISIS has been defeated, and may I say by the SDF, which we mustn't forget is an important player in the region. So it's not just, we're not left just with Assad now. We're left with 30% of Syria controlled by the SDF, who are our friends on the ground.
Yes, but you've got Assad helped by Russia, so it's not as if the SDF is suddenly going to take over the rest of Syria. We are where we are. So Diana Dark, I mean, the point is, should we then be rethinking our policy towards the whole of that region?
Well, of course we should. I mean, but sadly, there has been a complete lack of any coherent Syria policy. I mean, Obama didn't know what to do, and the legacy was to leave this big vacuum, which ISIS came into. We should never forget that it took 2 years for ISIS to come into the scene, and when they took over Raqqa as the head of the caliphate, the rest of the world said, oh, well, who cares? Raqqa's just some provincial backwater. What harm can they do there? And they were just allowed there. I mean, nobody in Damascus gave a damn about it. So for 2 whole years, they were allowed to grow like a germ in the perfect environment. It was only when they burst out then that suddenly we took notice. So we left this vacuum. First ISIS filled it, and then Russia filled it in 2015.
So just one final question, because we know about this one girl. Would you bring her home? Where do you all stand in that? Would you bring her home?
Very difficult. How old is she?
She's probably about 19 now, I think.
Tighten the legislation. We need to make sure that those that come home are dealt with properly, and that justice to the Yazidi people and to the Syrian people is given by this government, who also need to protect us at home as well.
Would you bring her home?
If she's only 19, I would look sympathetically at it, but yes, it needs to be very strictly done, certainly.
I would bring her home, and if the evidence is there, she should be prosecuted. We mustn't forget that women played a significant role in both enforcing ISIS's regime and in fighting towards the end of the conflict.
Thank you all very much indeed.